What is happening, Magnus sites?
As soon as I saw the title, I was like, oh, another banger. I know it's going to be funny. Let's get it. Oh, actually, yeah. Let me screen record. Never know.
Benjamin Franklin once famously quipped that there are only two certainties in life, death and taxes. And that's what I'm here to talk about today, the shocking rise in personal income tax rates over the past 10 years. Sorry, death. Specifically, death in media. Surely the ultimate and most permanent conclusion to any character's story. The end of everything they are, and everything they ever could be. Everything they might have said and thought, every task they might have accomplished, every life they might have touched. It all ends when they draw their final breath.
Yeah.
And just like in real life, they're passing off and leaves behind an aching void of emptiness and grief that other characters, and even the audience themselves, must struggle to come to terms with. At least it used to. Nowadays, the death of a major character is treated more like a passing inconvenience that can be easily fixed whenever the plot needs it to happen, or a hack writer wants to jangle some shiny keys in front of the audience for a bit of cheap nostalgia, or the studio decides they want to squeeze a bit more money out of a once popular legacy character. Whatever the reason, it all adds up to the same problem. Nobody stays fucking dead anymore.
I'll tell you this. You know, I don't have a problem with these fictional characters coming back. It's just one of those things. Especially, I assume that it's mainly comic books that are responsible for bringing characters back and killing them off, bringing them back, killing them off, because they go on forever. You know, books, usually you got a few written, you know, maybe in a series, and I know there are ones that have gone longer than others, but I think it's a comic book thing to do that, and I think it's just transferred onto mainly a comic book thing, and I think it's transferred into TV and movies. So I don't have a problem with a character being killed and coming back, as long as they do it right. There are ways to do it that can bring someone back that doesn't feel, even though it might be, that doesn't feel like a cash grab, even though you know it might be, you know, plain as day, but you know what? You'll be like, you know what? The way they wrote his comeback, I loved it. I loved it. You get what I'm saying? So, yeah. But a lot of comebacks are just not written well. So, yeah. And they feel like cash grabs, so.
And that creates some very obvious additional problems that we'll get into later. Believe that. But for now at least, let's consider some of the most popular and convenient paths for character resurrection. I mean, we'll leave out the absolute chads who just bring people back to life with no explanation whatsoever.
Somehow Palpatine returned. Somehow Palpatine returned. Somehow Palpatine returned. Palpatine returned.
Probably the least damaging method is to work more or less within the confines of the fictional world that you've created, usually when you've got highly advanced science and technology to fall back on. It'll definitely stretch the audience's suspension of disbelief, but with luck it can be done without completely breaking your own narrative rules. Like the Matrix Resurrections, for example. Remember Neo and Trinity? Remember how they both totally died at the end of Matrix Revolutions when Trinity took a steel girder to the gut and Neo got assimilated by Agent Smith, and then his brain exploded or something and he turned into sci-fi space Jesus? I mean, it wasn't high art or anything, but it got the job done, I suppose.
Yeah.
But what happens when you're a studio desperate to squeeze a little more money out of an old franchise, but you desperately need your two main actors to be involved again? Fuck it, let's just say that the machines fixed their bodies up, brought them back to life, and plugged them right back into the Matrix like nothing happened.
Yeah.
Genius. Or how about Colonel Quaritch from Avatar? Remember him? Probably not, because apparently half the world's entire population went to see that movie, but most of them could barely tell you a single thing about it today, apart from the blue people were cool and the planet looked nice and that made my brain do a happy. But the point here is that Quaritch ultimately got turned into a human pincushion and ended up very dead as a result. But what do you do when it's 15 years later and you need an antagonist for your sequel and you...
Yeah, it's like, I thought he was a really good villain. He was badass too. I thought he really worked, and that's why they probably brought him back. But as a Navi, I don't think it's really working.
You can't be arsed coming up with a new one. Fuck it, let's just say he downloaded his brain into an avatar body off screen, despite the fact that his entire character was driven by his complete and utter contempt for the Navi, and he absolutely would never have agreed to such a procedure, and bingo, he's back in the game like nothing happens. Fuck off, film. I mean, shit, man, sometimes we don't even need to wait for a sequel. We can just bring characters back to life in the very next scene. Like in Star Trek Into Darkness, when Captain Kirk sacrifices his life to fix the Enterprise warp core by kicking it until it starts working again.
It can't be serious.
Honestly, if you want a single moment that pretty much exemplifies the attitude of modern Star Trek, then here it is. Anyway, because J.J. Abrams only knows how to repurpose stuff that other people have already done far better, the whole scene is basically trying to mirror the death of Spock in The Wrath of Khan. But whereas that scene was poignantly handled and the audience was given an entire movie to process the grief of his death, and Kirk ultimately had to sacrifice his career, his ship, and even his own son to get Spock back, Into Darkness brings Kirk back to life literally minutes later by injecting him with Dirk Benedict Bundersnatch's magical Superman blood, which can apparently cure just about any disease or ailment, up to and including death itself. Damn, man, I sure hope they get a sample of that so that they can basically prevent any disease ever, instead of just forgetting about it the moment it's accomplished the one thing that the plot needs it for. Fuck. Another variation of the techno-jargon bullshit approach is to use the magical bullshit approach instead. Like in Wonder Woman 1984, where Diana uses the magical dildo crystal thing that grants wishes to bring Steve Trevor back from the dead. And for the purposes of this video, we'll just ignore the fact that Steve is actually inhabiting the body of a completely innocent bystander who absolutely didn't give permission for any of this stuff to happen to him, and couldn't consent when Diana decides to have sex with him, because I guess stuff like this is morally and ethically fine when a woman does it. Anyway, the goal of the writers was once again to bring back a popular character that had already been killed off, because they're so fucking lacking in anything even resembling imagination that all they could think to do was replicate the relationship dynamic of the previous film, thus making his sacrifice in that movie completely and utterly pointless. Son of a... Another approach, which is possibly the most destructive in terms of its far-reaching plot repercussions, is using time travel and or alternate timelines to bring dead characters back to life. I mean, how many times have the Terminator movies used branching timelines to wheel out an increasingly saggy and decrepit Arnold Schwarzenegger to do his T-800 thing again? A role that he hasn't been able to convincingly play since the 1990s.
I tell you this, it started to feel hokey even in the third one. It was just like, it's just a little much, and then it just kept going, but you went with it because Arnold's the Terminator, and I even, I liked 3. It was no masterpiece though. To me, 2 is the absolute best, period, point blank. 2, then 1, and then I'll think of the others. But Genesis, they're bringing back CGI. I didn't think that was bad because the way they did it, it's just like, it was a few years later, and it was like a whole different John Connor, and I was like, okay, this got a different feel and look to this movie. I was like, okay, and Genesis, and what's the other one? I'm done. Anyway, it just starts to feel hokey. The whole drapes and designing and interior decorator crap. I thought it looked really cool in the beginning when he took out John, but I was like, I thought John was coming back. Took him back to kill him. So he could insert another strong female.
And each time they do it, they have to ask the audience to conveniently forget whatever happened in the previous films because they've just been overwritten. Terminator Genisys effectively cancelled out the events of, basically the entire franchise up until that point, whereas Dark Fate asked us to pretend that everything after Terminator 2 never actually happened, while trying to replace it with a storyline that was infinitely worse in every possible way. It's a bit like going on a first date that's not really working out, and instead of just leaving, you burn down the entire restaurant and everyone inside it. Or Avengers Endgame, which suddenly threw in a time travel machine that allowed the writers to bring not one, but 2 major characters back to life, not only making their deaths in the previous movie completely meaningless, but opening the door to much bigger problems, like, why don't you use a time machine to recruit entire armies of superheroes from different timelines to counter any possible threat you could ever come up against? Why not do this every time someone dies or something goes mildly wrong? Why not go forward in time to procure advanced weapons and technology that can totally help you in the present? Why haven't other people and factions invented time travel as well?
The writer's mind. He thinks of it all. I dated someone who was an English teacher and writer, and she would think of everything, every plot hole, every problem. She would see things coming. It's like a handicap to them because they just know. It's just, you know what I mean? It's like some of us that watch a certain type of genre of movie a lot. You just see certain things coming. I've seen enough horror films. I know a lot of you have. Like, I've been watching Miss Carlo. I said, I guarantee there's a jump scare coming. I'm telling you, it's just like 10 seconds. Look, you see them walking? Their friend's going to come up and say hi, and it's going to scare them. It's like, told you. Told you. That's how they... I'm like, he's not dead. Trust me, he's not dead. She'd be like, how do you know? Because that's how it is in horror movies. They're never dead with the first shot, and they're down, and they think they're dead. They're never dead. You know, it's just...
Why isn't there a fucking massive universal arms race for such world-shattering technology? Questions like these most simply never end, because time travel is the ultimate narrative can of worms. Once you've opened it, there's no logical way to close it again, and it's only going to grow until it consumes your entire fictional universe, invalidating every plot point and destroying even the illusion of stakes and consequences. The final method is a word that I've come to utterly despise over the past couple of years, a word that's largely responsible for speeding up the downfall of modern superhero movies, a word called multiverses. Basically,
what movie is that from?
Playing a video game in sandbox mode where you can spawn in any character, situation, location, or item at will. Want to bring back a dead character played by the same actor, or one from a totally different version of your IP? No problem, just multiverse them into existence, and you barely even have to come up with a justification because who even cares, really? The fans certainly don't. They just want to see different versions of their favourite characters interacting with each other, making jokes and fighting bad guys. It's the movie equivalent of watching a little kid smash together their G.I. Joe and He-Man toys. It doesn't really make any sense, but it's entertaining at least from a novelty point of view. I mean, Spider-Man No Way Home at least did a decent job with the concept, mostly because the characters were handled with a hint of respect. There was a compelling emotional core driving things forward, and the movie knew to keep the narrative relatively contained and grounded. The problem is that just like with time travel, it opened the floodgates to a gigantic tidal wave of shit to flow out into cinemas. Suddenly everyone was jumping on the multiverse bandwagon because it was a fun gimmick, and when you're out of actual serious creative ideas, gimmicks are basically all you've got left. That's why we had Michael Keaton's Batman taking on CGI space aliens in a desert in the middle of the day, or Doctor Strange fighting an evil version
on an obvious green screen
of himself with a third eye for some reason, or Kang and this fucking floating potato threatening to conquer all of existence. It's what happens when one good idea gets hijacked by a bunch of useless hacks desperate to exploit the next big thing before everyone else gives up and moves on. And that, dear viewer, is the fate that awaits so many movies who try this kind of shit, because the obvious result of routinely bringing dead characters back to life with the most flimsy justifications is that nothing that happens carries any weight anymore, because it can all be undone whenever the writers feel like it. Whether it's through some contrived scientific or magical bullshit, alternate timelines overwriting past events, or different realities merging together, it all adds up to the same basic problem. Nothing matters anymore, so there's no reason to get invested in any of it. If your favourite character dies, so what? There's no reason to feel bad because they'll probably be back in the sequel. If the villain gets defeated, what difference does it make? Because they'll return for payback sooner or later. It becomes nothing more than a crutch for writers who can't stand on their own 2 feet and come up with new original ideas to move a narrative forwards. Because why take a chance on that when you can just bring back recognisable things that were once popular and leech off the success of other people's people's hard work. The end result is a kind of creative inertia, like a car spinning its wheels in the mud, splattering shit everywhere without actually making any forward progress. Combine this with the over-reliance on sequels, reboots and remakes, and we're fast becoming a culture mired in stagnation, recycling inferior copies of old ideas and properties with declining skill and passion. The stories we tell ourselves now have become simple commodities, as disposable and forgettable as a fast food lunch, rather than actual artistic endeavours with something meaningful to say. Hollywood might be able to resurrect any character that they've bought the legal rights to, but the one thing they can't bring back to life is the interest of their own audience. And I think this year they're going to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.
Let him stay dead. Yeah. I mean, he's right. He's right about a lot of stuff he said there, man. It does feel like just rehash. But you know what? Like I said, if you can do it right, okay. If you can do it right while also bringing out new IPs, trying new ideas, new stuff like that, that is great. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, it just makes me think of different movies that I may not have seen sequels to that I thought were like cool ideas, maybe not totally original, but you know what I wanted to see a sequel to? The One with Jet Li. It just made me think of that for some reason. I was like, that was different. Yeah, it dealt with multiverse, but it was different, and what about a sequel, that'd have been kind of crazy, like having to deal with him again and maybe some other type of scenario. But anyway, just a thought, just other way more original ideas I've seen out there from movies, but you don't see any sequels to them. But they'll greenlight, like they'll come out with a movie that they expect to do well, it'll tank, and then they'll still greenlight a sequel. Why? 10 million subscribers. Woo! Subscribe to the drinker.